In December 2021, a woman worth approximately $1,800,000,000 sat in a testing center in California and failed a law examination. She had taken the examination before. She had failed it before. She was going to try again. The coverage of the failure was organized exactly the way 20 years of coverage of everything she has done has been organized, as evidence that she was not serious, not credentialed, not the kind of person who earns the things she attempts to earn. In the same week, a parallel coverage cycle ran about her Skims shapewear brand, which had just reached a valuation of $3.2 billion. The two coverage cycles did not speak to each other. One described a woman failing at something she did not need. The other described a company she had built from nothing to $3 billion in 2 years. Neither cycle asked the question that the two facts together make unavoidable. What does a woman who has already won in every measurable financial sense do on Saturday afternoons? She studies evidence law. She fails the exam. She tries again. That is not the behavior of the person the famous for being famous narrative describes. It is the behavior of someone who decided at a specific and identifiable moment in her story that the money does not excuse her from doing the work. This video is going to tell you how she built the money. And then what she decided to do with it. There is a specific kind of dismissal that Kim Kardashian has received consistently and from people who consider themselves serious for the entire duration of her public existence. She is famous for being famous. She has no talent. She contributes nothing. The dismissal is delivered with a particular confidence reserved for conclusions too obvious to require supporting argument. And here is what 20 years of people delivering that dismissal have consistently failed to explain. How does a person famous for being famous build a skincare company that sells 20% of its equity for $200 million, valuing the brand at $1 billion? How does a person with no skills build a shapewear brand that reaches $4 billion in valuation within 4 years of its founding on product decisions about inclusive sizing and materials that retail analysts have identified as genuinely sophisticated? How does that same person get a 63-year-old great-grandmother who's been serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for a non-violent drug offense since 1996, released from federal prison through a direct conversation with the President of the United States, using arguments she had personally researched for a year? The answer is not what the dismissal assumes. The answer is that the famous for being famous narrative was, consciously or not, a mechanism for making the actual activity invisible while it was happening. The narrative made the activity invisible for 20 years. 20 years later, the activity has produced a set of results that the narrative cannot explain. This video is going to explain them, starting with the meeting in 2012 that nobody covered and that made everything else possible. There are three things about Kim Kardashian that the famous for being famous narrative has made structurally impossible to see. The first is a meeting. It took place in 2012 in a negotiating room with no cameras, and what she asked for in that meeting is the same thing that Oprah Winfrey asked for in 1986 and that Jay-Z asked for in 1995. The thing that almost no one in her specific position in the entertainment industry has ever had either the leverage or the commercial understanding to ask for. She asked for back-end ownership, participation in the value that the content generated, rather than simply a fee for producing the content. The network eventually agreed. Everything that followed, KKW Beauty, Skims, the billion-dollar valuations, the ability to fund the criminal justice work, the ability to study law without financial pressure, follows from the principle applied in that meeting. The second thing is an argument. The specific legal and personal argument she made to Jared Kushner and then to Donald Trump in the Oval Office in 2018 on behalf of Alice Marie Johnson, who had been incarcerated since 1996 for a non-violent drug offense. She did not walk into that meeting with a publicist's briefing notes. She walked in with 12 months of preparation and a specific knowledge of the case that the people around the president found unexpectedly detailed. The third is a number, 20%. The pass rate for the baby bar examination, the first year law student's exam in California, she failed it twice. She passed it on her third attempt at a time when she was already worth enough to hire every lawyer in California for the rest of her life. She passed it because the credential requires the test, and the test requires studying, and she studies on Saturday afternoons. And that is what a person who has decided the money does not excuse her from the work actually looks like. Kimberly Noel Kardashian was born on October 21st, 1980 in Los Angeles, California, the second of 4 children of Robert Kardashian and Kris Houghton. Her father was a defense attorney who became nationally known as a member of O.J. Simpson's defense team in 1994, a role that placed him, during Kim's formative adolescence, at the center of the most publicly contested criminal proceeding in American history, and that gave her, before she had any public life of her own, a specific and early education in the relationship between narrative and reality, between what people believe about a situation and what the actual facts of the situation are, between the management of a public story and the management of a private truth. The family was wealthy and well connected in the specific way of Los Angeles money, adjacent to entertainment, adjacent to celebrity, occupying a social world in which the mechanics of fame and the mechanics of commerce were not abstract concepts, but the furniture of daily life. Kim Kardashian grew up in rooms where famous and commercially powerful people were not exotic visitors, but ordinary presences. That early comfort, the specific ease with powerful people that comes from having spent a childhood in their unremarkable company, is the first available explanation for what the later story required. A woman who could walk into a meeting with the President of the United States and make a coherent legal argument was a woman who had spent her childhood watching powerful people conduct their business at the kitchen table, and who had understood from an early age that those people were not categorically different from other people. They had just made specific decisions and applied specific knowledge. The decisions and the knowledge were available. The comfort with the rooms was already there. Her mother, Kris Jenner, is the figure whose role the cultural narrative misrepresents most consistently and most symmetrically, dismissed as a stage mother who exploited her children for commercial gain by the critics, and celebrated as a marketing genius who saw everything first by the advocates. Both readings miss the actual thing. What Kris Jenner is, by the assessments of people who've studied her operating approach carefully and over time, is a woman of genuine and sophisticated business intelligence who understood earlier than almost anyone in the entertainment industry that the mechanics of celebrity were changing in ways that would make a new kind of commercial architecture possible, and who positioned her family with a deliberateness the people inside it experience in different ways and with different degrees of comfort to be in the optimal position when the change arrived. She is not a simple person. The decisions she made that have been characterized as exploitative are also decisions that a more honest accounting recognizes as the choices of someone who understood what the opportunity was and moved toward it without the hesitation that a more conventional approach to family life would have produced. Kim Kardashian is both the product of her mother's strategy and a person who has substantially exceeded what that strategy alone could have generated. The accurate accounting holds both of those things simultaneously. It is more complicated than either dismissal or celebration permits. Kim was, from an early age, the child in that family who watched most carefully, who absorbed the mechanics of the world around her with an attention that people who knew her during those years describe as unusual in a teenager, Not the loudest, not the most visibly charismatic, but the one who was paying attention to how things actually worked. Who actually had power in any given room and how they got it. What the people who lost their positions had done differently from the people who kept theirs. She worked as a stylist and closet organizer in her late teens and early 20s, developing a client list that eventually included Paris Hilton, who was at the moment of their professional relationship the most commercially significant socialite in America, the person whose operating methods were most visible in the specific environment Kim was trying to understand. The styling work was not simply employment. It was access to the mechanics of image construction and management at the highest commercially available level, observed from the interior. She watched how the most successful people in that world handled their relationships with the press, with the brands that wanted access to their name, with the networks that wanted to convert their visibility into content. She took notes, not literally, but the person who would eventually negotiate back-end ownership from a major entertainment network was, during those years, learning what the back-end was worth by watching the people who controlled it demonstrate its value in real time. The education was expensive only in the sense that it required patience. The sex tape, released in 2007, filmed approximately 4 years earlier with her then-boyfriend Ray J, is the event most frequently cited as the origin of her public profile and the most persistently misunderstood event in the full story of what she built. It did not create her visibility from nothing. Her association with Paris Hilton and her presence in the entertainment press had already established the beginning of a public existence. What the tape did was generate a crisis of a specific and concentrated kind. And the specific way she and her mother responded to that crisis is the key that unlocks the operating principle of everything that followed it across the next 20 years. The response was not denial. It was not retreat. It was acknowledgement combined with the immediate and deliberate conversion of the attention the tape had generated into the foundation of a platform. Keeping Up with the Kardashians was pitched to E! Entertainment within months of the tape's release. The network said yes. The show premiered in October 2007. This response, taking an event that most people would have managed by withdrawing from public life and using it instead as the foundation of an expanded and structured public presence, reflects a judgment about how attention and narrative actually work that the people who dismissed it as simply opportunistic never adequately examined. An opportunistic person grabs whatever is available. A person with genuine commercial intelligence converts whatever is available into the foundation of a sustainable structure. The distinction is the whole story. Keeping Up with the Kardashians ran for 20 seasons across 14 years, generating a quantity of content and a quality of audience relationship that the critical reception, which was dismissive for the majority of its run, completely failed to understand the commercial implications of. The show was not simply a reality television program, it was a content engine, a system for continuously generating the raw material that the commercial architecture being built around the family required to function. Every episode was simultaneously entertainment for an audience and a marketing infrastructure for everything the family was producing or planning to produce. The distinction between the two, between the entertainment and the marketing, was not a distinction the format was organized to maintain, and the audience, to a remarkable degree, did not require it. The specific quality of the show that sustained audience investment across 20 seasons was the specific quality of authenticity that professional performance management cannot replicate at scale. The conflicts were real, the emotions were real, the family relationships were genuine and genuinely complicated, and the audience could sense the difference between performed authenticity and the actual thing. That quality of genuine content, the specific texture that real emotional stakes produce in the people experiencing them, was the asset, not the ratings, which measured it, not the episodes which contained it. The asset was a specific quality of relationship between the audience and the people on screen, which would eventually, when the time came to attach it to products, convert viewer attention into purchase decisions at a rate that no conventional advertising campaign could replicate. But the show, the content engine, the audience relationship, the 20 years of sustained cultural visibility is the means, not the end. The specific event that transformed the means into the extraordinary financial results is not the show's launch, or any particular season, or any specific episode. It is the meeting in 2012 that generated no press coverage and that most analyses of her commercial career have given no adequate attention to. Because what happened in that meeting, what she asked for and what the network eventually agreed to, is the single principle that makes everything else in the financial story possible. Here is what happened in that meeting, and here is why the principle it established is the same principle that Oprah applied to her show in 1986. In 2012, in a negotiating room with no cameras, the family renegotiated their deal with E! Entertainment for the continuation of the show. What they asked for was not simply a higher fee, though the fee was also increased. What they asked for was ownership, a participation in the back-end value of the content they were producing, the syndication revenue, the international distribution rights, the digital licensing rights. That meant the family would not simply be paid for access to their lives, but would participate in the value that access created as it accumulated over time, in perpetuity, across every market and every platform in which the content was distributed. The network eventually agreed. That agreement, made in a room with no cameras by people the cultural consensus had decided were famous for being famous and therefore commercially unsophisticated, is the financial foundation of everything that followed. It applies the same principle that Oprah Winfrey applied to her talk show in 1986 when she negotiated to own the production company that produced it. The same principle that Jay-Z applied to his music masters when he established his own label. The principle that the people who build lasting commercial value from fame always apply, and that the people who merely experience fame almost never do, because applying it requires both the commercial intelligence to know what the back end is worth and the leverage to demand access to it. She had both. She applied both. The consequences of applying both are measurable, and they are large. KKW Beauty launched in June 2017 and generated $14.4 million in revenue in its first few hours of availability. The business press covered this as a demonstration of the power of social media influencer marketing. The cultural press covered it as a demonstration of the absurdity of a world in which someone famous for being famous could move that much product that quickly. Both accounts missed the actual mechanism. The mechanism was not the social media following alone, though the following was essential. The mechanism was the specific quality of the relationship between that following and the person at its center. A relationship built over a decade of personal disclosure, genuine emotional openness, and the sustained authenticity of a person willing to be seen in contexts that most celebrities carefully manage. That quality of relationship produces, in commercial terms, a conversion rate that conventional advertising cannot replicate. The rate at which a person's audience converts from attention to purchase. When she posted about the product, a specific and substantial percentage of the people who saw the post bought the product. That percentage was the product of a decade of investment in the audience relationship. The revenue on launch day was the dividend. Coty Inc. acquired 20% of KKW Beauty in 2020 for $200 million, valuing the brand at $1 billion. She built it in 3 years from zero. Alice Marie Johnson had been serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole since 1996 for a non-violent drug offense, convicted on 8 counts related to a cocaine distribution operation in Memphis, Tennessee, in which she served as a telephone courier with no violent criminal history before or after. She had been in federal prison for 21 years when Kim Kardashian became aware of her case through a video in her social media feed in 2017. The path from that video to Alice Marie Johnson's release from federal prison took 1 year. In that year, Kim Kardashian hired a criminal justice reform attorney to review the case file. She studied the relevant statutory framework and sentencing history. She made the calls. She arranged the meeting with Jared Kushner. She made the argument directly to President Trump. The argument was about the specific legal and personal dimensions of a specific case, presented by someone who had spent a year preparing to make it. Johnson was released within days. The coverage was organized largely around the cognitive dissonance of the event. The cultural category Kim Kardashian occupies and the activity she was engaged in were so incompatible within the existing framework that most coverage frameworks could not accommodate the gap without simply noting the gap and moving on. What it reflected was not paradox. It reflected the persistent and consequential difference between the public narrative about her and the actual person the narrative was purporting to describe. She enrolled in a law firm apprenticeship in San Francisco in 2019, pursuing bar admission through the California Law Reader program. The oldest pathway to the bar in the state and the least commonly used, which requires 4 years of structured legal study under the supervision of a licensed attorney, passage of the first-year law student's examination after the first year, an eventual passage of the full California bar examination. The first-year law student's exam has a pass rate of approximately 20%. She took it in November 2020 and did not pass. She took it again and did not pass. She sat for it a third time in December 2021 and passed. She sat for the full California bar examination in February 2022 and did not pass. She has stated she intends to continue. The law study and the criminal justice work are the dimensions of her public life that the people who have dismissed her consistently find most inconvenient, because they do not fit the framework the dismissal requires. If she is simply a content machine deploying fame for commercial gain, there is no commercial explanation for Saturday afternoons studying evidence law in preparation for an examination she has already failed. The commercial explanation does not exist because the activity is not commercially motivated. It is the activity of a person with something she is trying to do that the machine did not produce and does not require. That person has been present throughout the story. The narrative was specifically organized to prevent her from being visible while she was doing it. And here is the specific quality of what she built while the narrative said she was building nothing. Not the billion-dollar figure. The billion is the measurement. What she built is the mechanism that produced the measurement, a commercial architecture organized around the principle of owning what you create rather than being paid for access to it, applied systematically across every major content and product decision across 20 years. That principle and the specific intelligence required to identify, apply it, and expand it across categories from shapewear to skincare to criminal justice advocacy is what the famous for being famous narrative was specifically organized by the aggregate of cultural interests that found it useful to make invisible while the building was happening. The building is complete, the visibility is optional now. She made it optional. Here is what she actually built. Skims, the shapewear brand she launched in September 2019, after withdrawing the original name Kimono following public criticism about cultural appropriation concerns, reached a valuation of $3.2 billion by 2021 and $4 billion by 2023. The speed of that trajectory reflects a set of specific product decisions that distinguish it from celebrity licensing exercises despite the superficial resemblance to one. Celebrity licensing exercises produce products whose commercial value is entirely dependent on the celebrity's continued relevance. Kim's produces products that are reordered by customers who have worn them and found them superior to the available alternatives. The brand offered sizes from XXS to 5X at launch, at a moment when this was unusual in the shapewear category. That decision was not solely the product of progressive values, though the values were present. It was also commercially rational. It addressed an underserved market segment at scale. The underserved segments grew fastest. The brand's growth in size ranges that most competitors had historically treated as marginal drove a significant portion of its overall commercial trajectory. The specific quality of the product decisions, materials, construction, inclusive sizing, pricing relative to quality, reflects the kind of genuine commercial thinking about what a category lacks and what customers will actually repurchase. She made those decisions. The business is the evidence that she made them correctly. The Paris robbery of October 2016, in which she was held at gunpoint in a hotel room and robbed of approximately $10 million in jewelry, is the event in her life that the management infrastructure around her public presence was least able to contain. Because the trauma was real, and the public response to the trauma revealed the specific quality of the cultural relationship between her and significant portions of the audience that had formed around her over a decade. A substantial segment of the immediate coverage suggested the robbery was staged. A substantial segment suggested she had invited the outcome by displaying the jewelry publicly. These responses, organized around the same logic historically applied to victims of violent crime who are perceived to have attracted their circumstances through their presentation, were consistent with the specific quality of cultural treatment she has received throughout her career. The assumption that her circumstances are always, in some legible way, the product of her choices rather than the product of things that happen to people who have not chosen them. The trauma was not a publicity event. The extended withdrawal from social media that followed was not a publicity strategy. The slow and careful return to public life that came over the subsequent months was the behavior of a person who had been genuinely frightened and who was navigating the aftermath of that fear in the only way available to someone whose platform and income depend on continued public presence. The Hulu deal of December 2021, which moved the family's content from E! To Hulu's streaming platform, was structured differently from the original E! Arrangement in ways that reflect 2 decades of accumulated commercial intelligence about what the content is worth and who should benefit from its value. The specific terms are not publicly disclosed. What is publicly known is that the family retained a level of creative and commercial control over the Hulu content that the original arrangement had not provided, that the lessons applied in the 2012 renegotiation were incorporated into the construction of the next major content deal. The principle applied in 2012 was applied again in 2021 at higher leverage and with more sophisticated understanding of what the principle's application required. Own what you can. Control what you cannot fully own. Make sure the arrangement reflects what the content actually generates. Never accept the first version of the deal. The principle is consistent across every major content and commercial transaction in her career. It is the same principle, applied repeatedly and with increasing sophistication across 20 years. The sophistication is visible in the results are visible in the valuations. The honest assessment of what Kim Kardashian has built, stripped of both the dismissal and the celebration that have been the 2 available modes of public response to her since 2007, is this. A woman who entered public life under circumstances she did not choose, who was shaped by those circumstances into a combination of commercial intelligence, interpersonal literacy, and media fluency that most business schools cannot teach, and who used those qualities to build a commercial position that is, by any serious metric, one of the most significant in the history of consumer brand building from a celebrity base. The famous for being famous narrative did not build that position. She built it. The narrative was useful to the entertainment press, the fashion industry, the people who believed that celebrity should be earned through traditional talent, and the aggregate of cultural interests that found it convenient. But the narrative served none of those interests by being accurate. It served them by being easy. 20 years later, the position is built and the narrative is optional. She made it optional. The $1 billion made it optional. That is the most instructive thing in the story. The narrative was not wrong about what she was doing. It was wrong about what she was doing was worth. The Saturday afternoons studying evidence law are the clearest available evidence of what the worth finally accumulated and secured has been spent on. Not the luxury, not the visibility, the credential. The work, the case file of the next Alice Marie Johnson. Subscribe if you think the business story behind the public story is worth understanding. Because this channel is built on the premise that the famous for being famous narrative was not a description but a misdirection. And that the misdirection was organized to make the construction of $1 billion enterprise invisible while it was being constructed in plain sight. If this account of how the position was built, the 2012 meeting, the argument to the president, the law exam she failed and is still preparing to pass, change the way you will read 20 years of coverage going forward, click the screen now. Because we have other videos examining the commercial intelligence and private histories operating beneath the celebrity narratives that the coverage machinery was organized to present instead. The private histories are always more interesting than the public versions. They are also always more honest. Subscribe now.